leaning on the fence at the end. Can you hear me okay down there? Awesome. Awesome. My name is Jeff Darrington. I'm a volunteer here at the museum. I've been here about 7 years now. Had a lot of fun. It's amazing being here. I'm out here just this afternoon here to walk you through a quick safety talk. You'll see me walking out with these flags. Anybody that's spent time at a firing range or been in the military, when you see the red and green flags, you pretty much know what that means, but not everybody does. So I have these with me, and I have a horn. If we have any sort of incident on the field where we have to stop the show, maybe we have a breakdown or there's just something we need to stop, you'll probably hear 3 horn blasts like this. You might hear a fox whistle. A lot of our operation staff have fox whistles hanging from their chest. They'll blow 3 whistles. That means we're going to stop the show. Doesn't mean it's a major incident, just that we have to stop the show so everybody knows. You'll see these red flags and green flags. If we've got to stop the show, I might have to go out on the field with the flag. We'll have these posted over here by the tent where I'm standing for our announcements. Who's been here before? Excellent. What we're going to do to start off the show is, if you could, please remove your hats and stand for O Canada. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Just a note to everybody down at the end of the fence, we do still have some room in the bleachers, so if you go down and squeeze in, come on down. I'll just see here we've got a sand cat coming on the field. I'm not sure who might be in there, but I have a pretty good idea who's going to be in there. And what I'd like to do when the vehicle stops is introduce you to the Executive Director of the Canadian Tank Museum. His name is Jeremy Blowers. So he can't hear me right now. I want to play a bit of a joke on him. When he gets out of the vehicle, I want everybody to scream loud when I say, "Here's Jeremy Blowers." He's not expecting it, if you don't mind. First, I'm going to introduce the President of the Canadian Tank Museum, Al Duffy, everybody. How'd you like that welcome, Al?
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our last Tank Saturday, last show of the season, Armageddon. We saved the best for the last. You're going to see some big pieces of armor here, You're going to hear a lot about the history. Thank you guys all for coming to the Canadian Tank Museum. This museum is operated by 4 full-time people and 220 volunteers. And we have about 100 volunteers here to make this thing happen for you today. So let's hear it for our volunteers. Now, with a show of hands, who's been here before? We got to be doing something right. It's great. We usually have 30 to 50% people coming back on every group and everything because we like to do stuff different and change it up a lot. So if you like what you see, and if you visited the different displays at the MVCC, our conservation center over there, please consider joining our Band of Brothers. We have a recruiting booth in there, and they'll give you information on that. Because 220 volunteers, we make this happen. We pull it all together. We are the largest operational tank museum in the world, here in Oshawa, Canada. There are others that may have a few more tanks, but ours, most of them run. That's the difference. And those other museums, they don't have 220 volunteers, motivated volunteers that pull it all together and make it happen. So again, thank you so much for coming. I do want to say something. We are not here glorifying war. That's never been the intent. What we're here, we honor the service of our veterans. And that's what this is all about. This is the home of the Ontario Regiment Museum, but we kind of got bigger than just that. We're the Canadian Tank Museum, and as such, we're known around the world. So again, I'd like to thank you guys all for coming. You're going to see some really cool stuff, and it's all going to end with a simulated tank battle. And I'll let someone else describe the details for you. It's pretty cool, it's pretty exciting, and it's the only place you'll see that happen in the world. A simulated tank battle, and you're going to play a role in that battle that you're going to see. So on that note, I'd like to introduce our executive director, who's coming out right now. It's Jeremy Blowers, and he keeps us all together, and he's going to MC the balance of today's event. So let's hear it for Jeremy.
Thanks so much, Al. All right, let's hear it for Al Duffy, Museum President. And what an entrance he gave me in this Oshkosh Sandcat. That's an armored vehicle built in 2012. We have 3 of those in our collection. Well, a little bit of feedback there. I do apologize. Remember, I can't hear all the feedback because I have my hearing protection on. I'm going to warn you that this show is going to be very loud. Tank Saturday, Armageddon. We're going to have some of the largest, heaviest, and most dangerous military vehicles that were ever created in the 20th century roll in front of you here. Yes, you've been watching some tanks roll around, but you're going to actually feel the ground shake, even up in those bleachers, when this heavy armor comes around. And what is Armageddon? What is the theme? Well, this is a theme that actually has become a little bit more important in the last 4 or 5 years. We used to talk about the Cold War, about that time when the world was always, just on the edge of annihilation, nuclear annihilation, a third world war. And we're going to talk about that history. We're going to talk about the development of that equipment. But 5 years ago, much of the equipment that we are going to show you today was just a part of military history. It's unfortunate that what's happening in the world today is that there are dangerous conflicts, there are dangerous regimes around the world, and people have been saying that they're starting a new Cold War. So we're hoping that this lesson in history will show you the dangers of where the world finds itself now in the 21st century, in a new arms race. And many of these Cold War vehicles, unfortunately, are dangerous and on battlefields around the world today. And I'll talk about that as well during the show. But, you know, as Al said, we're not here to glorify war. We're here to honor our veterans and those who served and their stories. And conflict and war is no more abhorrent to anybody than a soldier. Having to leave one's home, leave one's family, and face that kind of danger and conflict. So we really like to honor our veterans. And speaking of that, we have a special group here today I want to recognize. By show of hands, is there any members here of the Royal Canadian Dragoons? How many members of the Royal Canadian Dragoons? They're here having a special 30th reunion, an anniversary of their time together serving this country in Bosnia. So let's hear it for the Dragoons and all the veterans here in the crowd. It is truly the hope of all the staff and volunteers at this museum that one day we won't have to be telling you these stories and how they're relevant to today's world, that one day wars and conflicts like this will only exist around the world in museums like this. And that is our hope. So, are we ready to see some tanks? I'm sorry, my hearing protection, it's pretty good. Are we ready to see some tanks? Marshall, roll out the tanks. So our story starts after the Second World War. And I'm going to start this story in 1956. So already a bit of a Cold War had been starting. And we had the conflict in Korea. And it was because of the Soviet Union. Now let's have a talk about the Soviet Union once we look at this T-54. after the Second World War, the Soviet Union had the largest land army on the planet. They were not satisfied with the destruction of Nazi Germany in 1945. They had control of most of Eastern Europe, parts of Manchuria, and we're also making new alliances in a new communist international with China at the time. And in all those conflicts, like in the beginning of the Korean War, our armies were still using the vehicles that came out of the last war, the Second World War. And that's a reoccurring theme you learn about here at the Canadian Tank Museum. Often the vehicles that one goes into conflict with were actually designed for the purpose of the past war and are often inadequate. But by 1945, the Russians had already been developing new tanks. While we were sending Shermans and Pershings and even brand new tanks like the Centurion into conflicts around the world, the Soviet Union had developed a new tank. And what we're looking at here is a Soviet T-54 main battle tank. Several versions of this was created. We have the early one, the T-54 you see here, and with some minor adjustments, they had the T-55. Now, why 1956? In 1956, the new Soviet Empire, which included lots of the nations of Eastern Europe in the Eastern Bloc, there was already some trouble. There was already some cracks there. And in 1956, there was the Hungarian Revolution. And to put down that uprising in Hungary, they sent in tanks and they sent in troops against the rebels and against civilians in Hungary. They deployed for the first time the T-54, T-55 tank, and it was shocking to the Western Allies. One of these tanks actually found itself inside the grounds of the British Embassy, had crashed through the gate and was inside the grounds. And the British had a short period of time in which they could study this tank, this something that was new, where the British had come out with a Centurion in 1945, and were having that as their main battle tank. But they were shocked at what they found with this new Soviet tank. The T-54 and T-55 had a 100mm main weapon. Also notice how short it is and low profile. It was a whole new generation of tanks. And that weapon could take out any main battle tank that the Allies had, including those that came out at the end of the Second World War and those that they were improving and developing into the 1950s. It terrified the West. And it created a whole new generation of military vehicles in the West. There was a race, an arms race, to create more powerful, more deadly, and large main battle tanks. Massively armored and mass produced. So they had the T-54, T-55. Then there's the Chinese building this design, the Type 59. It is believed that up to 100,000 of these vehicles were produced during the Cold War, up until the 1980s. We're talking about the 50s into the 1980s. For every Allied tank, there was at least 10 to 15 of these Soviet tanks in Eastern Europe. They were more powerful, they had better armor, and if the Cold War did turn hot in the 50s or 60s, the plains of Europe would be overrun by these. It had other interesting advancements that the Soviets had learned from the Second World War. If you look on the side of the turret of the vehicle, you see those rails? Those rails were actually to carry infantry. Should the Soviets attack in Europe, not only would they be flooded with this new generation of armor, but they'd be carrying millions of troops with them into Germany, into France, and into the rest of Europe. So this vehicle here starts the story of a whole new change in concept of tanks in the Cold War in 1956. And the Allies had nothing that could compare to this vehicle. Yes, a Pershing, a Centurion could go toe-to-toe with a couple of these, but in mass, these were exceptionally dangerous and deadly, and we had nothing to match it. So here up top we have Mihai. Mihai is a former officer of the Romanian army. He trained on these. And we have Chris Bennett. He's our maintenance coordinator here at the museum. They look after this vehicle and keep it running. So I'll just pause the story because it's all volunteers. Let's hear it for the T-54 crew bringing this vehicle out, showing it today. Because so many were produced, sadly, even in the conflict in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine right now, these vehicles are still on battlefields. They are in conflicts in Africa, in the Middle East. But let's see what the other nations were doing after they discovered the T-54, T-55. Britain, as you know, was the home of the tank. Britain being the home of the tank, they had a well-established armored vehicle production. And so Britain was definitely in the lead. They were the ones who actually got the first look at the T-54, T-55. And just a couple of the vehicles that they started developing before they had even seen that. Now, the world after the Second World War was still a very fractured and broken world. We are dealing with decolonization around the world, small conflicts, different nations, different leaders joining one side of either the capitalist or the communist divide that was around the world. And Britain had always built light tanks. If you look at the interwar period between the First World War and the Second World War, there was a lot of light tanks that Britain was building. And why is that? Because these were easy for the British to export to their colonies and export around the world to their dominions and allies in those small conflicts. And unfortunately, a lot of them served in those colonial conflicts. They didn't want to send huge centurions to Eastern or Western Africa, so they were developing small vehicles. So one of the vehicles that came out of the period is the CVRT, or Combat Vehicle Reconnaissance Tracked. Now, obviously outclassed by all main battle tanks, it's really used only in a reconnaissance role. It has everything that a light tank would have, and you can imagine if it's the only armored vehicle on a battlefield, it's very significant. But against any other main battle tanks, this is only a light recce vehicle, a vehicle that goes out front and reports back to the main force of what they see, what the ground conditions are, etc. There's a fantastic example of a Canadian recce vehicle and a hide right across the field under those trees. So after the show, if you haven't already, you can go see the M113.5 links and meet some Royal Canadian Dragoon veterans that talk about their reconnaissance role during the Cold War. Now, why this vehicle? It was fast. A lot of countries were going with smaller wheeled reconnaissance vehicles. It was fast, it was very maneuverable. We'll just show out some of the maneuverability. And it also was an export vehicle. So the United Kingdom and the rest of the NATO allies were not only arming themselves from this Soviet threat, they were exporting vehicles and arming their allies around the world. So originally they had produced this as an export vehicle. They ended up using many of them themselves right up into the 1990s. And we're talking about contemporary conflicts. Actually, Latvia just sent 200 of these and donated them to Ukraine as a light reconnaissance vehicle and armored fighting vehicle. Now, it does have some kick and power, not against something like the T-55. It has a 75mm main weapon. It's also armed with a coaxial machine gun. And you'll see a lot of these things on the vehicles in the MVCC. On the side of the turret, you see those with a little things protruding out with the little black covers on them. That is a smoke grenade launcher. So these vehicles, if they came up against something huge like the Soviet tank, they could pop those off, pop smoke, create a huge smoke screen, and get away from trouble very quickly. And that was would have saved a lot of lives, because obviously this against a T-54 or T-55 was not going to do a lot of damage. Now here from the museum, we have Chris as the driver, and we have Izzy as the crew commander. And they spent all of last winter preparing all the CVRTs here at the museum to keep them running. So that's a look at the British Combat Vehicle Reconnaissance Tract. So Great Britain, again, with its huge industrial capacity and its experience in building military equipment and armored vehicles, unlike many of the allies of the United States, the UK in a way was kind of competing with the United States and the other Western allies to keep that alive and producing a lot of vehicles. Now, if you've been here, you may have gotten a ride. If you're here earlier, you may have seen or gotten a ride in the M113, that American armored personnel carrier. But of course, the British were not going to purchase an American-made technology. They decided to design their own. And here we have the FV, or Fighting Vehicle 432. So this is not a tank. Yes, it's tracked. Remember, that very light tank you just saw, the CVRT, doesn't actually work in a tank role. It's a reconnaissance vehicle. The M113 and the FV-432, they are actually a armored personnel carrier, or APC. You might hear that term. And you notice how the Soviets, they were moving a lot of troops on their actual armored fighting vehicles and tanks. Well, the Western nations were much more mechanized, had a more established automotive industry. So in a conflict, British, Canadian, Australian, American troops would have been riding along into battle against the Soviets in their tanks. The soldiers would have been in an APC. So it's basically a giant metal box that is tracked, so it has the off-road capability of a tank. The American version was actually slightly amphibious, but the British, they had to go their own way, and they came out with the FV-432. On the top of it is a huge circle hatch. And the great thing about these vehicles is that they could be used in multiple roles. You could have them for carrying troops. You could have it as a mobile weapon system. There's often, you could have a mortar in there, and all the crew is protected from shrapnel and small fire by the armor of the vehicle. You could use them as armored ambulances. Now here, operating the vehicle, we actually have Paul. Paul, in most shows, for some reason, Paul, you end up driving the FV432. Paul is our museum training officer, and he's involved in brushing up the skills of retired soldiers and making them work for a museum environment, and also taking new volunteers, including civilians, and training them to operate these vehicles. So let's hear it for Paul and the FV432. So that AKC is great. The Armored Reconnaissance Vehicle. But what is Great Britain's answer going to be to these new generation of Soviet tanks? Of course, the Centurion was still in service, and it's probably considered one of the greatest main battle tanks of all time. But that 100mm gun could take out any main battle tank in the world. The British wanted to have the most powerful tank. And thus was born the Chieftain. This is actually one of the heaviest vehicles in our collection, weighing in almost at 60 tons. Having a speaker issue? Okay, we have weighing almost at 60 tons. Now look at this and you'll see it again in the parade portion of the show. When you compare this basically mobile fortress to the Soviet tank. It has a 120mm main weapon. When this came out in the mid-60s, there was no other weapon like it that could take out any tank or armored vehicle on the planet. Also in armor, all that weight comes from a ridiculous amount of armor. The front glacis plate on this vehicle. Let's have a look at this sloped armor. There's no shot at any time in the world when this came out that could penetrate that front glacis plate. It is actually so thick that the driver of the vehicle actually has to sit in a reclined sling to operate the tank. Then I want to show off the 120mm main weapon. So a replacement for the Centurion. This was to be the most powerful main battle tank in the world, and they were thinking that if you're going to be up against 10 or 15 Soviet main battle tanks, that the Chieftain could just almost sit there like a fortress while they tried to pummel it and pick them off. But also the long range of this weapon. To this day in 2024, this weapon, now in the Challenger tank, has the world record for the longest tank-to-tank kill in military history. It was during the Gulf War, and a Challenger 1 with this 120mm main weapon took out a T-55 at just over 3 kilometers away. So that just shows you just not only the range, but the firepower that the British were going for. But that wasn't enough armor. The British had to add more. So if you look on the side of the tank, you can see where the actual turret hull is, and then you see these bulges out the side. That they came up with something called, at the time it was very top secret, still blue armor. And it's named after the two guys who actually invented it. And it's a mix of concrete and rubber. So in addition to that massive armor plate, there's this additional half foot to a foot thick rubber concrete armor that added more weight to the vehicle, but gave it additional protection. And that would be the forerunner of some of the very special Chubbum armor that you see on the Abrams tanks today. That's still very top secret, and on modern German tanks. But in those early days of the Cold War, they came up with this Stilgru armor. Now, one of the largest tanks in our collection. Now here's the problem with the Chieftain. The Chieftain is both famous and infamous. There was something else top secret about the Chieftain when it came out. And yes, it scared the Soviets back. But what was top secret was the engine wasn't very good. They were experimenting with a new engine. They had a Leyland engine. It was a multi-fuel. It could be used for gasoline, or it could be modified and used for diesel. If you're out there in the battlefield and you run out of fuel and you need to take that fuel from the enemy, they had the concept of a modern main battle tank has to be able to use both fuels. So with the heaviest tank, with the biggest gun, with the most add-on armor, they put in the weakest engine. So when I say it's infamous, and this was a terrible secret during the 60s and 70s, they didn't want the Soviets to know. And I've spoken to many veterans who actually served on Chieftains, and they've talked about the driver often driving with a bunch of extra belts around his neck, so that, you know, when a belt did fly off the engine, they could quickly jump out and change the belt. Like it got that bad. Even here at the museum, it's often a privilege, but we have two running Chieftains, and they're great vehicles, but when I would not say they're the most reliable. So that's why we're exceptionally happy to have our crew here that looks after this. So here are the driver's hatch. We have Pete, one of our Chieftain drivers, hiding in the tank, probably not going to show himself off, and operating the turret so you can see the gun. That's Grant McCabe. He's the head of our Chieftain program. Oh, we have a special crew commander up here. Some of you may know from our sponsor of today's show, Steel Aces. We have Sophie line. Wave, Sophie. And let's hear it for these volunteers. Also, it's incredibly loud, and now you understand why I wear these. All right, that is the Chieftain Mark 11 main battle tank. Definitely deadly to any Soviet tank it came across, but maybe not going to be following them in the retreat, right? I have a mic issue. I think it's Sophie's mic. All right, Chieftain, roll out. It's a beautiful thing to experience and to see in action. So we're talking about the United Kingdom. Now, what about the Americans? So after the Second World War, when everyone thought that the United States would be able to go back to like they were before the war, as you know, there's a history of American isolation. But America, at the end of the Second World War, ended up being, one of the few superpowers that remained. And so their military production never stopped. It evolved. And the first vehicle we have here, we saw that slightly clunky FV-432, but one of the most ubiquitous American vehicles ever produced during this period was their armored personnel carrier, the M113 or M113, some people call it. So the M113, again, it's tracked, but it's not a tank. And let's look at the improvements that the Americans had on their design. It was actually such an incredible design that even if it wasn't for all the conflicts in the world today, these vehicles are still in military service with most NATO countries in one form or another, including Canada and the United States. So unlike the British FV-432, it's made out of an alloy aluminum armor. Once again, it's never designed to take a tank hit. It's designed to protect those inside from shrapnel and small arms fire, which then makes this vehicle incredibly light at around 19 tons. It also allows it to be amphibious and float in water. So you can see just above the tracks there, you see there's that little plastic piece there. That's to keep the water under the tracks when it tries to ford a river or a shallow lake. And it will move itself through the water with its tracks. So, when these were deployed in Southeast Asia and the Vietnam conflict and other places like that where there was a lot of rivers, it was very useful. And just like the FV-432, it came in so many variants. Ambulances, infantry carriers, command posts. And we're going to see a very interesting Canadian variation when we get to the Canadians. So these were some of the first vehicles, actually, that the West gifted to Ukraine when Russia invaded 2 years ago. And you can, unfortunately, you still see M113s in conflict both there in Eastern Europe and in conflicts all over the world. We've never really found a decent replacement. Military shows, right, 2023, 2024, all of the big manufacturers are always trying to find the better mousetrap or design the better M113. But it's just such a great design, it's such a useful vehicle that it will probably remain in service well into 2050. Of course, they take out the engines, they replace the tracks, they upgrade the systems inside, but the vehicle itself is just such an incredible design. And as I said, after the show, if you go to the gift shop, you can buy a ticket to experience it yourself, and you can ride in this M113. So here we have Tom and Connie. Connie is the crew commander. Believe it or not, they're a husband and wife volunteer crew, and other crew in this armored vehicle. And in the back, in the family hatch, and why they call it a family hatch is that's because where the soldiers would be, we have Drew. Hey, Drew. Another fantastic improvement was instead of having a really heavy armored door at the back of it like the FV-432, and I think you might have seen when Al Duffy and myself were getting out of that Sandcat, we kind of struggled with that massive, 200-pound armored door getting out of that vehicle. It actually has a ramp. So it does have a door where infantry can get in and out of the vehicle, but it has a ramp that can come down and deploy, and infantry can quickly get in and out of the vehicle. Think about the ramp on the landing craft, like in World War II, right? Coming on the beaches of Normandy and it comes down. Well, the vehicle does the exact same thing. So, once again, you'll see a lot of countries, and in the news that you'll be watching, after you've left this show, you'll now know that this is an American-built M113. Again, let's hear it for this crew. So immediately after getting all the technical specs from the British on the Soviet T-55 main battle tank, the Americans recognized that their Shermans, their Pershings were not going to be a match to this new generation of tanks. They started working on a new generation of American tanks right away. And they moved pretty quick, because if you think that they got those specifications in 1956, by 1960, they had released this vehicle, which is the M60 main battle tank. So, as for reliability, and both Canadian and American manufacturers are known for the reliability of their vehicles, unlike the British Leyland engine, this was produced by Chrysler. Believe it or not, this is a Chrysler-produced tank. So it weighs in at about 50 tons. So it's 10 tons less than the British Chieftain. It has a 105 millimeter main weapon, which was becoming a NATO standard. So all of the NATO members were moving their tanks. If they were purchasing their tanks from their allies, or they were moving to a standard ammunition. And why is that? If you run out of ammunition on the battlefield, you could just ask the logistics of your neighbor, hey, do you have any 105 ammunition? So they could share ammunition. So they decided to go with this, where the British decided to do their own thing with a 120 millimeter weapon. So yeah, the M60, we have 40 tons. Again, most of the armor is at the front of the vehicle. And this is going to be very important later in the show when we do the simulated tank battle. Look at the ridiculous mass of this sloped front glacis plate on this tank. So it doesn't have all-round heavy armor like that. The sides and especially the engine deck armor is a bit thinner. But this was designed to take direct rounds from that next generation 90 millimeter and 100 millimeter weapons that the Soviets were using at the time. They also were more about crew comfort. There's a lot of tanks here at the museum, and getting inside of them, many of them you almost wear the vehicle. Now the M60, you could deploy a lawn chair if you wanted. You know, I thought about bringing an Xbox one day and just doing a video of playing a tank game on Xbox inside there. I don't know. It's such a huge space inside. It's very comfortable for the crew. And as you also saw, because Brendan's up there, he has a second cupola there with a 50 caliber machine gun. So these were first introduced in 1960 and became the main American main battle tank for several decades. Now, in the early 1980s, they were coming out with the Abrams, which is the next generation, and these continued to serve in some theaters of the Cold War, and also well into the 1990s. You can see that this is in a desert configuration, because the United States Marine Corps actually deployed to Iraq in the first Iraq War, 1990-91, with M60s. It's kind of interesting. The second time this has happened today, we have Brendan up top. He's the crew commander. Say hi, Brendan. And we have Ashley as the driver. And again, they are a husband and wife volunteer combination that come out here and wrench on these tanks all the time. It's just now the roles are reversed, because like Ashley's driving the tank and Brendan is the crew commander. So you're going to see this M60 and learn much more about it in the finale of today's show, the simulated tank battle. Let's hear it for the M60 and the crew. So this is the Canadian Tank Museum. What was Canada using at these difficult times? during the Second World War, and maybe even Canadians don't know this, but Canada was a major producer of munitions and military vehicles from 1939 to 1945. Canada produced over 800,000 military vehicles during the Second World War. And we continued to build some vehicles, but on a smaller scale once this Soviet threat was identified. And what we're going to look at first in the story is this vehicle, which was actually built by General Motors Defense here in Canada. And this is an AVGV Cougar, or Armored Vehicle General Purpose. So once again, Canada didn't have the industrial base or the economy at that time as Great Britain had, or as the United States, to produce massive main battle tanks. Canada would have to look to its allies for designs for that, but Canada wanted to produce some of its own military equipment and keep that production here at home. So General Motors Defense, at first, they looked to a Swiss company, and this was a MOWAG design. They got the designs from an allied company in Europe, and they started producing a Canadian version of a European vehicle, and it turned out to be the Armored Vehicle General Purpose. Another interesting thing the Canadians wanted to do is, like the M113, the reason it has that name, Armored Vehicle General Purpose, is they wanted it to be adaptable to many different situations. So here we have the Cougar, and the Cougar is sort of the gun tank, or the weapon version. So it's used like that British CBRT in a reconnaissance role. It does have a 75mm main weapon to defend itself and also to provide some infantry support. It has armored doors on the back so it can carry troops and deploy troops. But they use this as a basis to build Canada's know-how in building these sort of things that would become known as the LAV. And if you've been in the Military Vehicle Conservation Center, if you know anything about Canadian military vehicles today, and some of the vehicles even that we are building and sending to our allies in Ukraine, you know that Canadian LAVs are well known and well respected around the world. And what does a LAV mean? Light Armored Vehicle. So in the museum we have two versions of the LAV 3. Now we have the LAV 6 that the Canadian Armed Forces are using and sending some of those vehicles to our allies. So the AVGP was considered the LAV 1. It was us just learning the technology and producing something in Canada. Most people who served in the Canadian Armored Corps and were deploying to Europe with other NATO forces, when it was in Canada, it was considered a training vehicle. So this is the vehicle, if you're in the reserves or if you're not overseas, that you're gonna learn gunnery on. You're gonna learn about looking after an armored vehicle. But the actual purpose of its design and purchase by Canada was just like that of the CBRT, to have a rapid deployment, rapid mobile armored vehicle that you could deploy in NATO missions, peacekeeping missions. And Canada didn't have the transport capability to move main battle tanks all the time all over the world. We weren't going to send our Centurions to a NATO mission or a UN mission around the world. We were keeping our Centurions in Germany facing the Soviet Union. So it's a great example of Canadian adaptation, Canadian built kit. And I'm sure that I talked about the dragoons, and you know this is the Ontario Regiment Museum. Our regiment used these and trained on these. And if anyone came out of the Royal Canadian Armoured Corps from about 1978 to 2004, they probably spent some time training as a driver, a gunner, or a crew member of the Canadian AVGP. So up top there, the crew commander, we have Rocky. He's a longtime member of the museum. Believe it or not, he's been a member here for over 40 years, well before the Canadian Tank Museum. And the driver, we have Alan Bissett. He looks after the AVGP fleet. He's been with us for, oh my God, almost a decade at least. So let's hear it for the AVGP and the AVGP crew again. Canadian made, right here in Canada. So once again, it was introduced in 1978 and served up until 2004, that later part of the Cold War, but it was building up our own production. So although Canada was producing military vehicles, like many of the members of NATO, the middle powers like Australia, Canada, and other NATO members, we had to look to our allies for the other equipment. But we often adapted it to the uses that we needed. I'll give you an example. So a country like Canada, yes, we have tanks. And we are responsible for having an entire armored tank brigade in Germany to be with our allies in case the Soviets attack. But there's only so many tanks that a country like Canada can afford. So this is obviously the basics of it is an American-built M113, but it's not an armored personnel carrier. Look at the top of it. It's an M113 TUA, or tow under armor. It has wire-guided missiles to take out tanks. If you only have so many tanks in your armored brigade, how do you supplement that? How do you supplement that power against enemy tanks? Especially in a way that's economical. So the Americans came out with this idea as well. This one is specifically Canadian, the Canadian TUA. And so we had an M113 with guided missiles that was designed to take out other tanks. And this would not only be effective when it came to combat, but this was a huge deterrent, and it worked right up into the 1990s. Now, this technology that was coming out, if we look at what's happening in warfare today with drones, and just before the drone threat, we're all hearing about javelins and how the shoulder-guided missile was changing warfare and was being a deterrent against Russian armored forces. Well, we didn't have that kind of technology in the 1980s and the 1990s. So this was a game changer, just like the Javelin was in the early part of the 20th century. That a small armored vehicle, a small unit, could have tank busting capability, and you didn't need to have that many main battle tanks, and that was the concept. Canada not only used these as a deterrent against the Soviets when we were deployed to Germany, but these were also deployed in certain situations in peacekeeping missions. This particular vehicle was deployed to former Yugoslavia. And at that time, the Serbians had T-55 main battle tanks. So Canada wasn't going to send a bunch of tanks to deter those tanks. Instead, we sent these, and they worked. I've spoken to veterans about actual stories where they would invite the Serbian colonels and generals to a demonstration. They'd have a haul of a T-55 tank out on another hill, and they would actually show them how it worked and how this TUA could take out a main battle tank. And once again, they were using it as a deterrent in a peacekeeping role. So it's just a real big turning point, and also how Canada was adapting to our responsibilities within NATO, but within our own capabilities. So here as the TC, that's the tank commander, we have Ben. Both of these young guys here, okay, have come, Jonathan Moss is the driver, and we got Ben as the TC. And I think today you're talking about, Al was talking about if you want to get involved, if you live close, and that we are accepting volunteers. And look how all the backgrounds that people are coming from. Yes, we do have a lot of retired military personnel, even a few serving personnel who are working on these vehicles, keeping them alive. These two guys came to the museum as co-op students. They got school credit for, emptying drip pans and sweeping tank dust off the floor. And now they're operating this M113. So let's hear it for both these guys, these volunteers, becoming a very important part of our team. That's the Canadian M113 Tow Under Armour. Canada did have main battle tanks. So once again, we looked to our allies. Now, after the Second World War, that Iron Curtain that was lying across Europe that Winston Churchill talked about, East versus West. Well, Western Germany, believe it or not, very quickly had to become part of NATO. So the defeated nation was split into West Germany and East Germany. And West Germany, they had many, just like the Soviet Union, just like the UK, they had designs and concepts that they were working on at the end of the Second World War that obviously never came to fruition. And so very quickly we wanted West Germany to rearm and start building tanks. And this is what they came up with. This is the Leopard main battle tank. Now think about that, it's a Leopard. It's a cat name. So this is the grandson of the Tiger, of the Panther, of the Puma, of all of those German designs of the Second World War. So started redesigning by the 50s, like once that we figured out that was going on in 1956 with the Soviet armor. And by the early 1960s, they had their first prototypes of this German-made tank. Now the Germans had another concept about armored warfare that was much different from what you've just seen from the British and from the Americans. The British put massive guns on their tank, and both of those nations put massive amounts of armor. Now the Germans, in the way of their thinking, said, tanks are becoming so large and powerful, the guns are becoming so powerful, again, a NATO 105, that armor will mean very little. It's the tank that hits first that will take out the enemy tank. So they sacrificed a lot of that armor for speed and mobility, and the Leopard 1 is considered one of the fastest main battle tanks ever made, and you'll see that in the finale of our show. So this Canada purchased, we kept our Centurions, believe it or not, up until 1977. Again, Canada being a middle power and looking at economic considerations. But by 1977, all of our allies were no longer using Centurions, so it was actually going to start costing us more. The Australians had retired them. We couldn't go to them for parts or help or ammunition, so we were in the market for a new main battle tank. So instead of going to the Americans or the British, in 1978, Canada started talking to Western Germany about purchasing their newest and greatest main battle tank, the Leopard. So the Canadian Armed Forces is interesting. You look, there's some domestically made vehicles and vehicles made from different allies, the United States and others. As I said before, Canada was responsible for having that armored brigade of tanks and other mobile forces in Germany. And These were deployed. This is based on a Leopard 1A3 with the welded turret design. Very quick, very fast, at just under 40 tons. We're talking about that Chieftain at almost 60 tons, the Patton M60 at about 50 tons, and now we have a Leopard about 40 tons. So 20 tons less of armor, much faster. Most of the armor on the Leopards is right here in the front glacis plate, and the sides are actually quite thin. They're going to protect the tank from shrapnel, small arms, etc. Now, let's look at the crew. At the front here, the driver of the tank, we actually have Frank Moore. Frank is one of our senior members. He's been a member here for over 20 or 30 years, I imagine, right? Up top here we have Ed. Ed's member has been with us for a couple of years. He came all the way from the east coast of Canada to be in today's show. Say hi, Ed. Then we have Oz. Now, let me tell you a story about Oz. And he's very proudly flying his regimental flag. And why is that? Because he actually, as a Canadian Armed Forces veteran, who served on these in Germany during the Cold War. So let's hear it for Oz. So once again, to be a part of this Canadian Tank Museum comes from all walks of life and all skill sets to put together these amazing crews. So Canada, in 1978, that was the beginning of our relationship with the Leopard tank that goes on to today. Canada retired its Leopard 1s, and we have different variants of them you can see in the museum. The last one was retired in 2017. Canadians deployed Leopard 1s to Afghanistan and other conflicts around the world after the Cold War ended. And today the Canadian Armed Forces uses the Leopard 2, which is a much larger, also a very fast tank that is used by Germany, Canada, and many other nations. All right, Canadian Leopard C1. Now that you've learned about these vehicles of the Cold War and what sparked that arms race, we're going to give the vehicle parade again. So you can, and I'm not going to be in the way, we're going to put on some cool music, and you can get a look at these vehicles that you've now learned about before we get to some really cool stuff in the finale of our show. you're the lucky winners of the Steel Aces raffle and you're going to be in the show finale, it's time for you to come up here to the CP. If you are the winners of the Steel Aces raffle, it's time to come up to the CP so you can get in your tank for the finale of the show. Okay, so now, before we get to the simulated tank battle, and again, excuse me, a lot of tank dust up here, our very special and lucky winners of the Steel Aces raffle are on their way into their main battle tanks. I'd like to introduce actually a longtime friend of the museum who's come up today from the United States to talk about something very exciting, Steel Aces. What is Steel Aces? You know that they sponsored the Canadian Tank Museum show Armageddon. So I'd like to introduce you and let's give a warm welcome to Sophie Lynn in the Chieftain main battle tank.
Hello, what's up, Canadian Tank Museum? You guys having an awesome time out here today? I heard the enthusiasm. So, I'm a tank fan and a YouTuber, and I'm here today with Steel Aces. This is the next great tank game. It is up and coming soon to your PC. You've seen us at the booth inside. Come in and take a look, but I have some two very special announcements for you today. We are very proud to sponsor Armageddon Tank Saturday here at the Canadian Tank Museum. And we're proud to announce, first here, you guys are the first to hear it, our beta phase, that's our test phase, our closed beta will be launching on the 14th of December. You all are invited to join in if you'd like to participate, testing and hanging out with us as we start to launch our game. Please come in and see us at the booth inside by the Fox Armored Car. The Fox Armored Car is a very special vehicle, and it didn't take part today since it fought in World War II, and it has a very special story. And that brings me to my next announcement, but I want a little bit of crowd participation first. Show of hands, who here learned something new today? Me too. I always learn something when I come down to the Canadian Tank Museum, and on this beautiful day, there's a lot of history here. A lot of history is kept alive here. It's bigger than our game, and it's bigger than all of us. And the Canadian Tank Museum team does a phenomenal job keeping the history alive. And I want to hear a big round of applause for the Canadian Tank Museum. You guys rock. And our special announcement is a collaboration project. Outside of our sponsorship of this event today, the Canadian Tank Museum's Fox Armored Car is going to be the first in our collaboration effort as a collaborative collector's vehicle for our game. We're taking the model for that exact vehicle and sharing its story for players in game when it's out. And so in the future, keep your eyes peeled for our announcement, because when this goes on pre-order, A portion of the profits from all sales of the Fox Armored Car and Steel Aces will go directly to support the Canadian Tank Museum. We think keeping the voices of our veterans and the history alive is one of the most important things, and the Canadian Tank Museum is a group that does it well. We're very, very, very proud to partner with them, and we hope you enjoy the event. We hope to see you in the future. And so a big special thanks to you guys here today, and from myself and Steel Aces, we are on the way. See you soon. Show.
Wow. So not only sponsoring Tank Saturday Armageddon and helping making it happen, but in their actual game about historical tanks, they're going to have real vehicles like the Fox Armored Car and giving directly back to museums like this. That's incredible. Thanks to Steel Aces, and thank you, Sophie. Thank you very much. Whoa. We're going to get these massive beasts off the field, and in just a few minutes we're going to get to the finale. So you've learned about the tanks, you've seen the tanks. Now how would you like to see how two tanks actually fight on the battlefield? Okay, and that's something that you'll soon be able to do in the game Steel Aces. So I'm going to get this stuff off to the tank arena. Sit tight. In a few minutes we're preparing for our simulated tank battle against two Cold War monster tanks. Sound great? All right, let's stand by. Okay, so today's show is not over yet. We're just going to get this armor off the field. As you can see, today's show vehicles are heading down to the tank harbor. After the show, when it's safe to do so, those gates will actually open and you can go meet the crews, get up close with these vehicles, and get more detailed information. Of course, I'm just going to talk about each vehicle for a few minutes, but trust me, our volunteers love to speak about the vehicles they work on and their military history. So you'll be able to go down to the tank harbor and check out those vehicles. What else can you do? You can head back to the Military Vehicle Conservation Center, see some of the vehicles I talked about in the show, meet with Sophie and the Steel Aces team, learn what that was all about, have a good look at the beta version of that game. And of course, our gift shop will remain open for another hour, and you can get a ride in an M113. Now, taking a ride in M113, purchasing something from the gift shop, that also helps the Canadian Tank Museum. It helps us keep these vehicles rolling and keep history alive. So while we're getting the armor off the field, our two contenders in the simulated tank battle are getting ready. A thing about the simulated tank battle, okay? This is not choreographed. These are crews. They've been training for years. They're highly trained in the operation of their vehicle. They are going to come out and they are going to actually try to outfight, outsmart, and outmaneuver the enemy tank. They're actually going to be firing at each other, and this is going to be very loud, but don't worry, they're not firing shells. It's a movie trick. It's simulated fire. It's an oxygen propane that builds up in the barrel and then fires, but it is very loud. Not as loud as a real tank shell going down range. So they're going to be moving fast, getting into position, using the features of the tank arena to best protect the weaker parts of their tank and get shots on the enemy tank. Now, how do we decide who wins the simulated tank battle? Yikes. I think it's a rough connection.
Check one.
So how do we decide who is going to win the simulated tank battle? You decide. With what you've learned about tanks and armored vehicles today, it's going to be the crowd, by applause and cheering at the end of the battle, that's going to decide who wins Tank Saturday Armageddon simulated battle. And it means a lot to these crews because this is the season finale. This is the last time they're going to be able to face off until the season of 2025. So does that sound very interesting? Okay. Again, when I introduce the tanks, and you have met the crews, when it comes back here into the tank arena, and I come back on the field, you're going to be voting for the tank. You're going to be voting for the tank that did the best job to outposition, outfire, and outsmart the enemy tank. You're not voting for your favorite tank or your favorite crew member, just in case you know them, right? So those are the rules. Just because you like this tank better doesn't necessarily mean that they've won the simulated tank battle. Let me check with the marshal and I'll see if we're ready to go with the finale. Okay, they're ready to go. And our first contender is a German-made Leopard main battle tank. This is a Belgian Army Leopard 1A5 weighing in at almost 40 tons with a 105 millimeter main weapon. Very similar to the Canadian tank, but this once again, this is a Leopard 1A5. It's a later version than the 1A3 that we were talking about in the Cold War. These particular vehicles are still in active service with 14 different NATO nations, and about 200 of these are currently in the Ukrainian Armed Forces. The contender of this very fast Leopard main battle tank is the Chrysler-built pride of the USA, the M60 main battle tank. So let's hear it for our tank crews before we get started. So once again, they have to use the strengths of their tank against the weaknesses of the enemy tank. The M60 has 10 additional tons of armor. It will be slower than the Leopard, but any shot by the Leopard on this front glacial plate here is probably just going to bounce off. The Leopard, on the other hand, a front shot from the M60 could penetrate, not all the time, it could penetrate that frontal armor. So the Leopard is going to have to use its speed to get into a firing position and get a shot off on an M60 on a weak spot. The Leopard's going to have to use the features, the hills, and try not just to get pounded by this very powerful M60 main battle tank. As for firepower, they're both the exact same weapon as I explained. They're 105 millimeter L7 gun, main weapon. They share the same ammunition. Leopard crew, are you ready? M60 crew, are you ready? Now for this segment, I'm going to get way out of the way, okay? It's going to be fast, it's going to be loud, and I will be giving just a little bit of commentary over the mic when I see them do something pretty decent or something very stupid. So, are we ready for a simulated tank battle, guys? Come on. Yeah, even with this hearing protection, I don't have to make you guys go again. Hey. Hey. Take your firing position. You can see that Leopard move fast. M60 is barely in the fire position, and the Leopard is already, look, they're already trying to track the target, find the M60. Nice pivot by the Leopard. You see, trying to put their strong, oh, first shot off by the Leopard. Would it have landed? Return shot by the M60. Quick second shot by the Leopard, and using its speed, charging down the field. Notice that gunner is tracking. Leopard trying to get into position now. The engine deck of the M60 is exposed. Look how quickly that Leopard got behind that hill. Whoa, probably right up the engine deck of that M60, using that speed advantage. Second shot by the Leopard, firing quick. Look how the M60 turns that strong frontal armor against the Leopard. Basically, any hit to the front of that M60 is not going to penetrate the armor. Looks like the Leopard crew has figured that out. They're going to reposition. M60 crew still tracking the Leopard as it moves. M60 doesn't want to get lapped again and expose its rear engine deck. Look at the speed of that 40-ton main battle tank on the rear stretch. M60 tank crew tracking, lost target. Leopard in firing position, pivoting for armor. Very difficult to get a shot on the move. M60 is not even going to take a firing position. It looks like, oh, no, stopped. Got one shot off on the Leopard. And then charging back down the field. Battle tank, but notice the M60 gunner tries to traverse over the rear engine deck. Both are in good firing positions. Both trading shots. this time, the M60 actually in firing position well before the Leopard. Can they get a beat on the enemy tank? Leopard still positioning. Great shot by the M60. Another great shot by the M60. Leopard tank coming up fast. M60 coming. Leopard tank now completely. Can he get a shot off into the engine deck of that M60 a second time? Nope, M60 gets around the corner. Leopard gunner did not have it on target. Again, M60 pivoting frontal armor towards the enemy. And a shot on the Leopard. Any shot by the Leopard right now would be a 50-50 on a hit, penetrating that armor. And okay, let's bring them up front. Okay, this is where it really comes down to you. You hopefully learned a lot about tanks today. Again, I'll explain the rules before we vote. You're not voting for your favorite tank. You're not voting for your favorite crew. And yes, good attempt, we're not voting for our favorite flag either, right? Okay, can't sway votes that way. I wonder if that's considered election interference. Okay, you're voting for the crew. How did the crew use their vehicle, use the features? How did the crew keep their gun on target? When the gun fired on the enemy, were they just bouncing it off the front glacial plate of a tank, or was it a good shot? Okay, did they outplay, outsmart, outfight their opponent? So, once again, not the tank or the crew. Which vehicle crew used their tank to the greatest advantage? You guys understand? Okay, this is where you have to be loud because I'm standing between two main battle tanks and I have this on my head. Who believes, by applause and cheers, that the M60 crew won the battle? No, not bad. Not bad. They won the last two. I want to hear that again. Who believes the M60 crew won this? Okay. Who believes, with applause and cheers, that the Leopard crew won the battle? I'm sorry, M60 crew, you had a fantastic 2024 season. 2 wins, that win at Aquino Tank Weekend. But we're going to give it to the Leopard crew today. Champions of Tank Saturday, Armageddon simulated battle. Congratulations to the Leopard crew. So, that concludes our show for today. My name was Jeremy Blowers, the Executive Director of the Canadian Tank Museum. One more applause just for all the volunteers who put this incredible day together. And thank you so much for supporting the Canadian Tank Museum. There's so much to see and do here today. Head down to the Tank Harbor. Head to the Military Vehicle Conservation Center. Meet with our sponsors, Steel Aces. Talk to them about their new and upcoming live-action tank video game. Please stop at the gift shop before you leave. And I'll see you here in the tank arena during the 2025 season. Thank you very much.